Hello and welcome to Church in Maine. The podcast is at the intersection of faith and modern life. I am Dennis Sanders, your host, and happy December, happy Advent. So today we're going to be talking about transportation. And I've always been someone that has been interested in transportation. I guess that is par for the course. When you come from Michigan, when your parents both worked in the auto industry, you're going to be someone that's going to be interested in getting from point A to point B. And I'm fascinated by all types of transportation, by planes, trains, and automobiles. Yes, I did purposely do that. Um, I love talking about things like mass transit and high-speed rail. The thing is, basically, if it has wheels, I'm interested in it. I can remember as a kid, I was always by our long drives from Michigan to Louisiana to see relatives. I just kind of also had a fascination with the interstate highway system. All of that is just I'm really into transportation, and maybe at some point I could have been, um, interested doing some type of engineering of some type, but that never happened. But so oh well. But one of the forms of wheels that I have been interested in that I did not mention is the bicycle. And I remember as a kid tooling around my neighborhood in 1970s. I can remember being maybe 8 or 9, and you know, going a block or two away from my where I lived was like encountering a whole new world. And as I got older and got into my teens, I started to bike farther and farther away. And I remember biking as far as the huge Buick City complex back in my hometown of Flint, Michigan. This was in the mid '80s. I had to be about 14, maybe, and it was to me it was cool to be able to bike that far. Um, kind of bike around where my dad worked for a living. Um, My mother, though, was not so crazy about me biking that far away, but um, that's kind of what happens as a kid. But now I'm in my 50s, and I'm realizing in some ways I need to get back into exercise after all the COVID years. So I'm looking at maybe hopefully at some point this winter, early spring, uh, getting on a bike again and heading out on the road, exercising on two wheels. The interesting thing about the biking world of the 2020s is how different it is from the 1980s. If you go back to the 1980s, most people they either biked, for exercise, or it was something that kids did, um, and that's not really the case anymore. I mean, those things still happen, but it's very different, especially where I live now in Minneapolis. Minneapolis, along with St. Paul, basically give Portland, Oregon a run for its money as America's most bikeable cities. Um, Many people here in the Twin Cities like to bike to work, and they don't really let a little thing called winter stop them. Even during the long and very cold Minnesota winters, what you'll see are people on their bikes. They will be heading to their places of work, and usually what they do is they trade in the smaller bike tires for those really wide tires that help with traction in the snow and ice. They will continue to do that. Um, and I think while America is nowhere near the Netherlands when it comes to biking, I think that for millions of Americans, um, biking has become a legitimate form of commuting. Um, this has all made me think about, how does making your way around the world on a bike different from driving a car? And how does riding a bike or even walking impact your Christian faith and the ministry of the local church? So, my guest today is someone that is also interested in transportation, but he has taken his interest one step further to make it an issue of discipleship for him. Travis Norvell is the pastor of Judson Baptist Church in Minneapolis. And about a decade ago, he decided to put his money where his mouth is, and he gave up his car and started getting around Minneapolis via bike, public transportation, or on foot. And when he did that, he started to really see the world and the neighborhood around his congregation in a very different way. And Travis has become an advocate for helping Christians in many ways get out of their cars at least once in a while and move around their world in a different mode of transportation to see what they might be missing, and especially around their church. Travis has written about his experiences in a book. He is the author of the book Church on the Move, a practical guide for ministry in the community. And as I said, he talks about his story and also how you can become more familiar with the neighborhood around your church. And stay tuned in this podcast because one of the reasons that I got to know a little bit about Travis, and I had known a little bit about him beforehand, but really got to know about him because he kind of became an unofficial um, kind of traffic person, bike traffic reporter for Minnesota Public Radio, um, and I think you'll enjoy hearing his tale about how that happened. So, with all of that, let's listen to Travis Norvell. Well, Travis, thanks for taking the time to chat with me this morning.
Oh, thank you, Dennis, for having me. Thanks for the invite. Very glad to
So,
be here.
great. So, I think maybe the thing to start out with is that you have an interesting story about how um, you ended up kind of looking at the world from a kind of a different viewpoint instead of from a car, from public transportation and biking. Um, this is an interesting subject for me. Transportation has always been a fascinating thing because I'm originally from Michigan,
Hmm.
um, and both my parents worked for General Motors, so um, I really am always fascinated about all different types of transportation. I mean, I definitely because I'm from Michigan, I'm a car guy, but you know, biking, public transportation, trains, planes, I'm always fascinated by that. So I'd like to hear your story about how you kind of came to this kind of revelation of how to see things from a different perspective.
Yeah, sure. I'd be glad to. So about 10 years ago, it was in the middle of what we call in Minnesota a polar vortex, which should scare most people, and myself included. In the middle of all that, I had a car that I dearly loved. It was a Volkswagen. I bought it in New Orleans. It was. I later learned that it was flooded during Katrina, so it was had some problems that wasn't on the title, but that's okay. I love this car. It had heated seats. That was the one thing I really wanted. And one day the heater broke in it, and I'd poured all kinds of money into it, and I was like, I'm tired of doing this. So that was a thing that was going on in my life. And then I preached a sermon on kind of really just a basic kind of social justice sermon. My daughter at the time was 11. She was listening, and I posed a question. What are you willing to sacrifice so that others may experience joy? Um, and I go to tell her goodnight, and I said goodnight, Seneca. I'll see you in the morning. And she just said, "Hold on, Dad. You asked in your sermon what others are willing to sacrifice so that some may experience joy, and I'm just curious, what are you going to sacrifice?" And at that moment, I just felt like a complete phony to her, and my mouth went ashen. I didn't have an answer for her, and I just said, "I don't know, but I'll tell you soon." So that night, I turned the dining room table into kind of a makeshift midlife crisis center, and had laptop and 4 or 5 notebooks and stuff. And I said, okay, I'd always wanted to ride my bike and take public transit and walk, but I'd tried several times, but couldn't really figure out how to do it. And so I spent that whole night just figuring it out. And so that morning and breakfast, I just say, hey, kids, I've got it. I'm going to sell the car and I'm going to ride my bike and walk and take public transit. And they had this look of abject horror on their face, which they should have, thinking that this will affect them. But I said, no, this is just my deal, not yours. And they breathed a sigh of relief. And I said, we're still going to keep the van, so we'll be okay. So that started it. And from there, I just started walking and riding my bike and taking public transit, and it was a complete reorientation of life. I got to, I mean, like I'm a liberal social gospel preacher. That's my tradition, and I realized that I was hardly spending any time at all with the poor, with those with their backs against the wall, just people struggling to go get by in life. But you're on a bus, and that's who you're sitting with, and you hear their stories, and you hear their passions and joys and heartbreaks. It was just amazing. When I walked, I ended up finding my neighborhood that I didn't know existed. So, I know houses now by smells. I know which house is cooking, Italian on Wednesdays, and which house is cooking curry on Thursdays. I mean, these things you just get to know. And on my bike, I realized, a lot of people are trying to make it in life. Um, by that, I mean just they're struggling financially, and they're on a bike because that's all they can afford. And realizing that, how can cities really lift these people up and more, and how can churches be more part of their lives? I mean, that's kind of the story in a nutshell.
So it probably helps to understand what is the neighborhood like around your church.
Oh
Um,
yeah,
I'm familiar with it because we're both here in Minneapolis, but for people who aren't there, how would you describe the neighborhood?
yeah. My neighbor, it's South Minneapolis, and this is a residential neighborhood. And I can cross about three or four different kind of economic zones, with houses that are very nice, and one within a stone's throw of the church is the former ambassador to Morocco lived. Um, I can go in the other place. I can go 10 minutes in the other direction, and that's the site where George Floyd was murdered. If I go a little bit farther south, I'm in kind of the lakes area, but there's lots of lakes here. Uh, I'm in lakes. I'm in six sections of town where everyone looks like me, as a white cisgender male, but I can go just a little bit farther and be in a totally place where hardly anybody looks like me. So I should say on one thing, where the church is located, it's a very stable, comfortable uh, neighborhood. The neighborhoods around it, are in transition, and they're full of wonderful people, but there's a lot of pain in them as well.
So, do you think your ministry has changed um, by being able to take public transit or walking or taking the bike um, as opposed to driving? And
It made me a lot more focused. I think most times as a pastor, I would think of my parish really as kind of like the Twin Cities, which in some broader way it is. But I mean, that's a lot to take on for one church. So by shrinking it down to really a parish-sized model, what I call a bikeable parish, which is about a 15-minute ride from my house to the church, and this is kind of in vogue in Europe. These 15 to 20-minute cities. This idea of neighborhoods. Um, well, that focuses where I am, and who I'm coming in contact with, and really trying to get to know the neighborhood. And by doing this, I found out that no one knows hardly anything about the church I serve. They don't even know it's here. I have people that live within just around the block. Well, perfect story I have is one of the persons who was the chair of the neighborhood association. I was having coffee with him, and I asked him, "What do you know about Judson Church?" And he said, "I love your yellow Adirondack chairs." And my thought was, well, that'd be great, but we don't have any chairs. We don't even have any grass at our church. And I realized he thought that we were the Episcopalian church about half a mile down the road. And for most times, I would love to be confused for an Episcopalian priest, but that wasn't this wasn't the case. So I realized that people don't know hardly anything about the church or who we are or what we're about. And walking the neighborhood and riding my bike in the neighborhood and taking public transit in my neighborhood at least put me in contact with people and having relationships with them that I wouldn't have had in a car. And I think that's really been the change. It's been more community focused. Um, and I feel, when I pray for the city of Minneapolis, I'm really praying for the people that I run into every day. And they're telling me what their stories are, and those really inform how our approach to ministry at this time.
So you talked about the fact that the church is not far from where George Floyd was murdered back in 2020. Um, how did that event really, and because by that time you were, of course, that, basically didn't have a car and all that.
Mhm.
How did your approach to that event change from what could have been if you were still just had your second car?
Yeah. It, Again, it's all about the vulnerability and exposure part of it. So when George, and after George Floyd was murdered, and when we all got the word of it, I just hopped on my bike and rode to 38th in Chicago, and start. You met people instantly, and I would go probably, geez, I don't know, for months. It seemed like I went every day, or at least 4 or 5 times a week. And what that enabled, how that kind of changed me, and how it kind of changed the church. Again, it was relationships. You started meeting people, you started hearing what needs were, and I was able to say, hey, there's, to kind of coordinate with other churches that were providing really just basic needs, but also just doing some wonderful ministry work there. You could kind of direct and say, hey, there's a church over here that needs diapers. That's what the community really needs right now. And you could put that word out and people got it. Or we knew that like Appetite for Change was really struggling and needed all the help they could, is because they were providing meals not only for people in need, but Appetite for Change at every protest, at every community event. They were there with grills, feeding people and just providing this space of wonderful hospitality. And I think we raised, $20,000, 30,000, just putting the word out that, that this is going on. And on a bike, it just enabled me to get from A to B a lot quicker. There were so many places that were streets were blocked off. Um, Protests were happening. The police had other places blocked off. But on a bike, I could kind of zigzag through all these places, and get from A to B, and talk to people and hear what was going on. And that was a big change. I could see that, and there would be, on a bike, I would pass people in cars, because they just couldn't go anywhere in the city. There was so much clogging of traffic, but on a bike, I could kind of zip around, and I could kind of fly under the radar. I had my clerical collar on, and no one really paid much attention to me. So, uh, yeah.
And how do you think all of this, especially how, I mean, I think as the role of pastor, as leadership, is sometimes we're basically models of how people are obviously looking to us as role models. Has this had an effect on the congregation at Judson in any way, that have other people kind of joined in, or if not, maybe seen things from a different perspective?
Yeah, I think there's been several ways. When I started this is my own apprehension as a leader. I'm not. I wasn't doing this so that other people would mimic it. Or I said, look, this is what I feel God's called me to do. It's not an indictment on you if you drive here, or anything like that. And I kind of just left it as that to see how it would organically happen. And what did happen and what is happening, on Sunday mornings, there are quite a few bikes that are out there, or people will say, "Hey, I took the bus from this day, and this was my story that I heard," or, "Hey, I'm starting to walk the neighborhood more." So, I mean, there is kind of that multiply effect of people doing it. But I think really about 2 years ago, I just thought to myself, I think I'm going to go all in with it. I'm just going to commit to this as not only just my thing, but how can this change the church's approach to the ministry that we're doing, to be more community focused. And I think that's been helpful for people to hear more stories about the neighborhood, and it gives us more of a sense of, okay, we're going to try to do things with the largest impact within the Kingfield neighborhood, and then hope that it kind of spreads and ripples out. And I think that kind of clarity has really helped people. I mean, the best example I can give is just a few weeks ago, we did a pie baking seminar. We told everybody it's the holiday season, and if you're intimidated by baking pies, we've got some church ladies that are going to teach you how to bake a pie. And we had about 20 people here. Only four were from the church, and the rest were all from the neighborhood. Um, so just that kind of thinking that before all of this, I don't know if we would have been thinking like that, but it's helping us.
And so, one of the things also that I have heard a little bit about is how do you use spaces that aren't always used throughout the week? And probably, obviously, there are lots of church buildings that aren't used out. Probably one other thing that isn't on the church property isn't always used as much during the week is the parking lot. So I'm kind of curious that you have an interesting story about how you're using that, or um, and kind of really kind of doing more than just having it as a space for cars to park
Yeah,
your
well,
car.
yeah, the funny part is we don't have a parking lot. As a kind of a landlocked church, we don't
Uh,
have a parking lot.
okay.
But my idea, but what I'm trying to encourage other people to do, um, if you don't have a parking lot, if you do have a parking lot, change it into a church plaza. So it's not just there for only for the temporary storage of automobiles. So if you know anything about Minneapolis, you know that we are kind of in Lutheran world, and there are some gigantic, you know, ELCA churches here, and they're doing great work, and I love them. I think they're great places. They have these gigantic parking lots, and I like to take pictures of the parking lots throughout the week, just as an example to see this thing is hardly ever full. Maybe on a Sunday morning they're full. Maybe if there's a large funeral, they're full. But the rest of the time, at the best, it's 25% full. So how can we use this space in more productive ways other than just thinking of it as just a place to store cars? And some examples I have, why can't we bring back basketball courts for church parking lots? I grew up playing basketball in church parking lots. With biking, rather than how about a vacation Bible school? Also, how about a vacation bike school to help the people in the neighborhood, both young and old, learn how to ride bikes? It'd be a great way to have an e-bikes on an e-bike expo, so people could figure out how to ride them. Um, just all kind of skills course for kids to be able to weave in and out of cones or something. There's all kinds of stuff laying around in churches that could be used as obstacles to get around and move. I think of farmers markets, places. There's the Kingfield neighborhood farmers market has moved 3 or 4 times. Just okay. Where is there a church parking lot it could be housed in? It also is just growing food. You can grow food in a parking lot. You can take two spots with straw bale gardening. You can produce enough food in one summer to feed a family of 8. I think you're not really talking about giving up great amounts of space for that. And the one thing that people don't realize is that in most cities, uh, church parking lots are kind of this free, like a free zone. By that, you have all these zoning requirements, usually within cities that prevent new developments or new things. But in church parking lots, they have this weird autonomy that doesn't exist anywhere else in a city. And some churches are experimenting by taking tiny homes and putting them in their church parking lots and housing people that are experiencing homelessness. There's one church that's trying to just take homeless veterans and give them a place, and they are using their space in this way. They're doing maybe 3 or 4, creating a little village, and then they're using the already existing infrastructure in a church. So for a shower or a community kitchen or the library as a study and communal gathering space, and then providing this, kind of living quarters and these tiny homes. And I think these are just fantastic ways to show that a parking lot can be a plaza, can be a place of life, and can be a place of growth, both internally and externally, than just this place where people store a car for a few hours. And I think if we can just start thinking about that, really, there's an abundance of space that we have available, and how can we use that in a better way?
Yeah, the China home. I think you're might be talking about the settled um, ministry,
That's
which
one of them.
is
Yes, yes,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And actually, the where I work during the week is a Lutheran congregation in Forest Lake,
Hmm.
which is an exurb of the Twin Cities. That's trying to do that same thing. They have a big parking lot that they have more space than they could use, and I think that it's a great idea of using some of that for people who don't have a home and to have some homes. So yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that one. Definitely all the ideas, but especially that one.
I find it. There's a church, First United Methodist of Los Angeles, that sold their building, and all they have is a parking lot. Um, so every Sunday they haul out these tents, and they have a church service out in the parking lot, and then they take the tents down, and then they rent their parking lots out for the rest of the week. And then they're also using it for overnight. A lot of people, they're living out of their cars now, and they are letting people come into their church parking lot, park there for the night, providing them free Wi-Fi, a little bit of services of what they can. At least it's just a safe place, kind of a protected space. So there's all kind of things we could be thinking about.
Yeah, I don't think that probably would work in Minnesota,
No, yeah,
but
yeah.
but Los Angeles, yes, it could.
Los Angeles
Yes,
they can let that happen, right? Exactly. Yeah.
yeah, it would. You'd have to wear lots and lots of parkas to, but Um, so one of the questions also is, this is we kind of talk about this as from the context of urban churches. Um, what about suburban or rural churches? How does this kind of whole thing work from that perspective?
Yeah, and that's a question that people have asked a lot, in response. And I get that. I really wrote the book for small neighborhood urban churches. I mean, that was my focus. But I still think there's some of the things can apply. Um, when I was back home, I'm from West Virginia, and for the heck of it, my mom lives in a small town, and the bus terminus is behind her house. So I wanted to see if where could I take this bus to? Um, I could take that bus and ride it. I couldn't get over this for 52 miles from her house to the farthest point in Kanawha County for $2.50, and it would take me to all kinds of places. Now that doesn't mean that every rural or small town place in America has this kind of bus system, but I'm like, okay, if this can happen in West Virginia, it can probably happen in a lot of other places as well. So, what infrastructure is there, and how can it be utilized? And the other part is that I know a lot of suburban churches and rural churches have vans, have church vans. So why, if you don't have the public infrastructure there, why not use what you have? You have a church van. Why couldn't it be a public witness that a church van is going to go around and pick up as many members as it can on a Sunday morning? So at least nobody's riding alone to get to church. At least there's this somewhat of a communal feel that can happen. And I also find that in a lot of suburban churches, they have resources that urban churches don't have. I mean, they do have space, and there are a couple of places that you were talking about parking lots. I mean, they usually have bigger parking lots than urban churches, and there could be some partnerships that develop between an urban church and a suburban church, and even a rural church. How can we think of ourselves not as just three separate churches, um, or maybe more than that, but just thinking of ourselves as one body with different members that relates to their neighborhoods in different ways, but can use resources to help each other out. I think there's a potential that I think could be there. Um, and I also go back to my hometown, St. Albans, West Virginia, maybe 10,000 people. Um, but there's a lot of self-contained communities, in America, small towns that have grocery stores, post offices, maybe some kind of medical clinic. that could, in many ways, be bikeable cities, and could help out with wealth. I mean, not with wealth, but with health. It maybe could generate a little bit of wealth, but taking away the expense of a car. That you could be maybe a little bit stronger of communities. So I think those are the parts where I think this idea could be a little bit more integrated into. But I'm in some ways I'm aspirational with this.
Do you think that there is also something that in people in churches just, even if they do, they're not going to give up their car, still just walk around
Yeah,
their church for the heck of it? I mean,
yeah.
is there something to be said about just getting out and walking, not doing anything special, but just getting to know the neighborhood?
Yeah, I think, let's say that you drive to church 52 Sundays a year and you're never going to stop that, right? I mean, there are people, and I'm sure, like in your congregation and other congregations that are listening, right? We have people that the church that they love is the only church that provides them community. And so they seek it out for what it provides for them. And you don't want to make anyone like that feel ostracized from that. But I think there is a great value in having people just walk your neighborhood as part of Sunday worship. Um, one of the things during the pandemic, we weren't meeting in person that much, so I would just say, "Hey, on Sunday at 11, we're going to meet at the church and we're going to do a bike ride around the neighborhood just to say hello." And I was surprised at people that just joined us on these bike rides. Um, I've got an idea. This is another aspirational one that I just learned, and I haven't had a chance to do it. But in the Episcopal Church, there's this rogation days
Mm-hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm.
where you're supposed to walk the parish, kind of the outline of the parish, walk the parish, and that was supposed to be a way to connect the parish and kind of the farms that are on the outskirts of the city. I mean, why couldn't urban churches, suburban, rural, also have that same practice? We're going to once a month we're going to have a rogation day. We don't have to call it that. It can be whatever it is. We're just going to walk. Maybe we're going to 10 minutes in one direction, and then we're going to walk a circle around there, and just to see who we meet, who we engage. Um, and I would say that I would suggest this. A few years ago, there was a woman who painted these wonderful murals um, on garage doors in South Minneapolis, and we wanted to see them, so we had a map to walk through where they were. And walking on the alley as opposed to walking on a sidewalk, I couldn't get over the different way that people interacted with you. On a sidewalk, you're knocking on somebody's door and they think that you're a do-gooder or you're trying to sell them something. But on the alleyway, people were just more engaged. I met more people in the alley than I ever have, and had one person walk up to us, say, "Hey, what are y'all doing?" And we told them what we were doing. They're like, "Hey, we just moved here. Can you tell me where the best spot to get ice cream is?" Um, and we told them, "Well, I really like this place," and someone said, "I like this place." So it was just an interesting way to meet people, in your neighborhood by walking in the alley as opposed to on the sidewalk.
Yeah, I do some walking in my own neighborhood in North Minneapolis, and it's
Hmm.
fascinating to sometimes go down the alley instead of the
Hmm.
sidewalk. It just, you see different things that you wouldn't normally see if you're just walking down the regular sidewalk.
Yeah,
So
and a lot of those are hidden, right? That people want to
yeah,
have
yeah.
privacy, and I understand that. Yeah, yeah.
Hmm. And it's something that growing up, we didn't have an alley. It was just kind of a driveway into a garage. So
Hmm.
there's something I like about the alley that's a little bit different. Um, it's a little bit more interesting than just having a driveway,
Yeah, yeah, it is
personally.
totally more interesting. Yeah.
So one of the things that you have been known for, at least here locally, is that you kind of do, I guess, biking traffic reports for Minnesota Public Radio. Um, how did that start?
Well, so last winter, I was reading a book by Catherine Hayhoe, that climatologist. Shoot, and I can't remember the title of the book right now, but it's a wonderful book, and I recommend everybody to read it. But she had this wonderful line: "Is stop thinking about stop for climate change. Stop thinking of all the things that you can't do or can't be changed. Can you find one area where you can make a difference and offer someone an alternative? That maybe that's where you start. So I had that book. I had those lines in my head, and then I was listening to Minnesota Public Radio, and they were giving the traffic report, and it was, you know, 18-wheeler jackknife on the I-35, or there's a car fire at 280, all these kind of things. And so on a whim, I just texted the personality, Kathy Werzer, and said, "Hey, Kathy, if I give you bike reports on what it's like on the bike lanes for the winter and sidewalks and stuff, would you tweet them out?" And she said, "Sure." I found out later that she thought it was just a lark and like whatever. And so we started doing it, and she started reading them, and the response was pretty amazing. People started to enjoy them, and then I realized I have to write these little. I've got 280 characters to try to describe both the sidewalk, bike lane, and road conditions, but also try to make it just intriguing enough that someone who's not walking, biking, or riding would at least be aware of what's going on. So it became a kind of a challenge, a fun challenge to how to describe the way the snow was interacting with the road. And that happened. And then a couple of people picked it up, the idea that there's an article in MinPost. And then I was doing a podcast about this was right about the time the book was coming out too. And a guy from England was interviewing me, and he writes for Forbes magazine too. So then he did an article in Forbes magazine about it, which made this ridiculous kind of thing that these little tweets, all of a sudden we got more exposure. And then I got all these emails suddenly from I've tracked it down to 3 continents. People wanting to know, how do you do a winter bike commute report for the radio? Hell, I don't know. I'm just goofing off. It's been a lot of fun, and I make no money for it. They don't even give me an NPR sticker or anything. But I know that we did make it into the twice. We've made it to the NPR pledge drive. So I think it's fun. Yeah.
So, I mean, how has one of the things I've known living here um, now for about 25 years is how much this is truly a winter. People don't stop biking just because there's snow on the ground. They, put on their bigger tires and just keep biking. It doesn't matter if it's 20 below, they're still doing that. Um, what has been what have you learned? What have been the challenges for you, biking during the winter time?
Well, there's thousands of them. You learn your limit about what you can and can't take. And for me, it's when I walk into the office or in a meeting or wherever, and I start talking to someone, and in my head, I sound normal. But to other people, they're like, I can't understand a word you're saying. And I realize my jaw is frozen, and I'm just kind of, everything's just a big mumble. So I'm slurring everything. So I'm like, okay, maybe I need to stop that. But I've learned more than anything is you got to move in the winter, right? And you got to figure out ways to get whatever vitamin D you can get it. And I find that there is kind of seasonal depression that happens here, and I've suffered with it too. So trying to do anything you can helps with that, and it's made me really appreciate. I mean, I loved winter before. I love it even more now. It just gets you out, exposes you to other people, and it's great. Great conversation. I love it when a car pulls up to me and they roll their window down, and the person starts having this conversation with you at the stoplight. And I use every opportunity as a little bit of evangelization, like, hey, you can get out on here too if you thought. So that and the group of winter bikers, you meet them, you get to know them, and it's almost like you got a little bit of a camaraderie. And when you see each other out, it's more than just a hey, how you doing? It's really kind of more of a Star Wars, may the force be with you kind of nod that you give to each other, and I appreciate that.
So I think getting close to wrapping this up, I'm kind of curious, as opposed to kind of other metro areas around the country, how do you see the Twin Cities when it comes to biking? I think that there are obviously, I did a lot more biking when I was younger in the 80s and everything. it seems like things have changed a lot. That there's much more accommodations for bikes, but and kind of from your standpoint, how does Minneapolis, St. Paul stack up to other metro areas when it comes to biking?
Yeah, every time I go on a conference or anything, first thing I do is go to try to find an REI because you can rent bikes pretty cheap there. Get on a bike and see what the city's like. And I got to say, I know that our rival here in Minneapolis is Portland to try to see who's got more bikers. But I love Twin Cities as far as the infrastructure we have, the accommodations, like you say. I just think that we're ahead in a lot of other cities. And if you want to try to do this, I think this is the place to be. I was talking with a theologian the other day who's also a big transit person, and I asked her, I got a sabbatical coming up. I'm like, where do you think I should be? Where should I go to study to figure out what we should do? And her response was, you got to stay where you're at. You got to like really dive into the Minneapolis, St. Paul, Hennepin and Ramsey County, because I think this is going to be the center of alternative transportation in North America. And here's if you're going to try to figure out how churches can be more beneficial or be a part of this, she said, I think you just need to spend that sabbatical here trying to figure out what's going on. So I think that's a pretty big, endorsement of kind of where we're at and what we have to offer.
That is, I
Yeah,
was
and we have no
actually
hills. Yeah,
well, yeah, that that helps
yeah, yeah.
because I don't think I would do well if it were San Francisco.
No,
Um,
no, or Seattle. I mean, yeah, yeah. So, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
so that's interesting because I was guessing maybe she was going to say Amsterdam, of course, because
Oh well, oh
they're
no,
so well
of course,
known.
right. I mean, that's a whole different ballgame. Yeah, yeah.
But that is true. That is a very whole different ball game. But that is a ringing endorsement of the Twin Cities. So
Yeah, I mean, I did speak with a librarian at a seminary in Amsterdam, and I asked him, can you tell me like who? Can you tell me about the way that churches are integrated into church? I mean, bicycles are integrated into church life, and his response was, "I don't understand your question." So I asked him again. He was like, "No, you don't understand. Like, there is no separation. Like, you know, bicycle life is just part of who we are. It'd be really hard to try to separate it out from that." And I was like, "Okay, this is a whole new place we're talking about."
hmm
Yeah,
yeah, I have not been to Amsterdam. I'm curious to go.
yeah, same
Um,
here.
so I usually when I go abroad, I again because I'm a car guy, I'm always interested in what kind of cars and all that. But there, I'd want to see what kind of the whole biking thing, just because it's such a fascinating how much they are into that and oriented. I mean, they actually have bike like freeways and all of that.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah, I'd love to visit and just learn from that.
And there's surveys that come out that show that it's um, the happiest drivers in the world are in Amsterdam. Um, I mean, you take so many people because there's so many people that are off the road, either biking in a different way, they're walking or taking public transit, so the streets aren't really crowded. So it's a great place for people to drive. They say.
That is fascinating.
Yeah, yeah, yes, I find it fascinating too. But I'd love to go and figure that out. But yeah,
Well, Travis, thank you so much. This has been a great thing. We've been able to kind of talk about things I really like to talk about, which is transportation and churches. And I didn't think I could ever have an interview that would put those two things together. So thank you.
oh, thank you, dude. It's just been delightful. I love this. Thanks.
All right. Take care.
You too.